I spent every single dollar I was willing to bet on the commercial viability of this novel on hiring a top-tier professional cover designer. I do not regret that decision, but it did leave me with no money left over to spend on interior art, which would have been fine, except I wrote epic fantasy. And maps, original maps that are very expensive to commission for exclusive commercial use, are part of the minimum viable product. I can't justify spending that kind of money on a map when I'm not even confident I'll recoup the cost of my cover. But breaking genre conventions and not meeting reader expectations seems like a really bad idea as a debut author, so I don't really have a choice. I'm going to have to do the art myself. How bad could it be? It's just a bunch of lines on a page. Hey, it's Deborah with a walkthrough video. I'm going to talk you through the process I use to create a map that I'm happy to publish as part of my debut fantasy novel for zero money up front. Is it good enough to pass as something that you might commission from a professional cartographer? Is it worth all the time that I ended up spending on it? Stick around to the end of the video for the reveal so you can judge away in the comments. The first thing I did was Google fantasy map generators, and there were a lot of options out there. I picked the 2 that were free for commercial use and sat there mashing F5 until I got something that I liked the look of. Once I had that, I went, great, map done, I'm just gonna get on with writing the book. I was operating on this vague idea that I could just take the output from these tools and just stick it into the book because, I mean, these look pretty good, right? Except when I got around to laying out the book this week, I quickly ran into some problems. Even though these tools have an export option, you can't really configure it. I spent a ridiculous amount of time messing around with them, but no matter what I tried, it just looked like I was sticking a shitty screenshot into my book. So that clearly wasn't going to work. That left me with paid tools. The 2 most popular ones out there right now are Wonderdraft and Incarnate. Both of these are priced quite reasonably, and Incarnate actually has a free option, but it does not come with the ability to use their maps for commercial purposes. I did try it because I did figure that if worse came to worse, I could still get something that I could use for commercial purposes for no more than the price of a coffee, and that was something I was willing to explore. But I found the overall experience quite fiddly, and I soon worked out that if I wanted to get my map to look the way I wanted it to and not like every single other map from Incarnate out there, I would have to spend a lot of time tracking down the right assets and fiddling with everything to get it to look distinct and original. So I went back to the drawing board. I needed to start with my target readers. So I looked at a whole bunch of maps from both traditionally published and self-published titles for titles that were comparable to my book as well as titles that were not. So I could get a good feel for the range of the different types and styles of maps out there, as well as the minimum quality of benchmark that I needed to hit. By and large, my comparable titles had stylized hand-drawn maps that were mostly monochrome with simple line art and a little bit of shading and detail. The simplicity of these maps made me feel a whole lot better about the idea of doing my own art, mainly because it seemed like it would be within my current illustration capacity, which basically involves drawing stick figures for my kids' books. And I felt a lot better once I remembered that I do not need to be competing with the likes of Stewart. I just need a map that doesn't suck. And unlike my first half-assed attempt at drawing a map for my NaNoWriMo 2020 project, I was going to be drawing a map with better equipment, a lot more illustration experience, and I was going to put a whole lot more time and effort into it. Next up was binging a whole heap of map making tutorials on YouTube. Most of these are aimed at teaching you how to draw a map from scratch and cover things like basic geological principles. And even though I was using procedurally generated maps as a baseline, I still found it helpful to understand the principles involved in putting together a realistic looking map. Once I got my head around all that, I opened up a new canvas in Procreate and imported my screenshots. I'm using Vellum, which automatically calculates the image size that I need based on the trim size that I've selected for my print format. But if you're not using Vellum, you can figure out what size you need by looking up the print specifications for your printer. I use Procreate because I like the illustration experience with it and I already had it from doing my kids' books, but you could use other programs like GIMP or Krita, which are both free. And if you have access to a good scanner, then you can use pen and paper as well. From there, it was a tedious but straightforward process of tracing and then detailing. I started with tracing the main features on both of my base maps. So coastlines and rivers for my continent map, and the shoreline and city walls for my city map. From there, I filled out the map section by section, working from the larger details to the smaller ones and using the baseline maps as a guide for where things should be in terms of biomes and things like that. The world map, I didn't end up deviating all that much. The most tedious part of it was doing the forest. There's a couple of different ways to do forest, and the ones that looked the least terrible when I did it was Kagor's method, which relies on cloning one tree like a million times. And yeah, that got really tedious fast. But for the city map, I actually deviated from the procedurally generated map quite a lot for two reasons. Number one, because I had stupidly made the city map plot critical, and so I had certain key landmarks and things like that I had described in the book and that I needed to place in specific locations because you should be able to figure out what the plot twist is from looking at the map. Secondly, the Watavo city map generator is the landmark feature is kind of buggy. You're supposed to be able to customize it. I could never get it working. I had to give up. So in the end, I just got started drawing in my key landmarks, the ones that were significant to the story, and then I just haphazardly filled out the rest of the details from there. By this time, I had deviated from the underlying city layout quite a lot, and there were things that I had to fit in there that weren't in the procedurally generated version of the map. And this was where watching the questing-based video tutorial really paid off. In that particular tutorial, he goes through how city layouts develop over time and how roads and buildings tend to be placed. Understanding those principles meant that I didn't need to overly obsess about where I was placing all of these other random buildings and alleyways, and just really get into a good flow to finish off the map. Very last things I did on both maps were to fill out any remaining blank spaces and add labels. At this point, I had a choice. I could either stick with doing everything in Procreate and put up with the horrible text tool, which doesn't allow you to lay out text along a curve and also causes save and undo issues, or I could transfer the art over to a different program with better text handling and finish it off there. Ultimately, I decided working across two programs was going to be a bad idea because I had tried that with doing text layout in Procreate and then later doing the book layout in Scribus for my kids' books, and yeah, that did not go well whenever I had to update it. So I've learned my lesson now. Do everything in one program where possible, otherwise it will drive you insane. Once the maps were done, I posted them in a couple of different places for critique. And the main things that came back were issues with the typography and issues with how I'd drawn the glaciers. Since I suck at calligraphy and have terrible handwriting, my only option really was to just trace over the font that I had chosen in the hopes that it would kind of look a little bit more organic. And this is 2 hours of my life that I will never get back, and I sure hope that this was worth it. As for the glaciers, I tried so many different options, including the thing with the tiny lines, but I either hadn't picked the right brush or I was working at too low a resolution. Whatever it was, I couldn't get it to look not terrible, and so I'm basically stuck with these plateau looking things until I can figure out a better solution, which at this point is just going to be, I'm not going to set any part of the story in this region of the world so I just don't have to deal with the whole glacier issue and potential breeder confusion. We'll see how long that lasts with my discovery writing brain. 40 hours of my life later, and I have two maps that are going to be a double page full bleed spread in my print version. And this is how it turned out. I'm pretty sure it doesn't suck, but what does suck is I missized my canvas. Maybe I could just resign myself to not having a full bleed on the hardcover, except I really like having a full bleed. Whatever, it is a problem for future dev. Was this worth the opportunity cost of 40 hours that I could have spent writing 20,000 words of new prose or revising the prequel that is supposed to be my reader magnet? I honestly don't know, and I also don't know how to design a test that would accurately measure that. The only thing I do know is, based on the market research I've done, epic fantasy readers expect to see original maps in epic fantasy novels. So that's what I'm going to deliver. What do you think? If you were me, how would you have spent those 40 hours? Let me know in the comments because I'd love to hear your thoughts. Now that I've got all the interior done and I know the final page count, the only thing that's stopping me from ordering proof copies is the fact that I haven't finalized my blurb. And this is how that's going.